I was hoping to get under the wire on that and not get recorded. And the big Friends book sale is, of course, this weekend. So Friends and Foundation book sale. Consider attending that out of the fairgrounds. You can learn more about how to join the Friends and Foundation or volunteer with them at their website, cbcplfriendsandfoundation.org, or do a web search. To see the schedule of upcoming Random Review events, grab a bookmark from the back of the room or visit the Random Review webpage from the library homepage by way of the Random Review button. On that page, you will also find a list of related books compiled by volunteer Gail Gerdeman, some of which are on the counter in the back of the room. You can also find links, and those you can check out, of course. You can also find links to video recordings of each event. This year, we are streaming all the Random Review events live. In fact, I believe that started yet last year, if not earlier. So you also have the option to view them from home as they happen. Now then, today's selection is James by Percival Everett, presented by Tracy Daugherty. Our thanks to Marjorie Sander, who will now introduce him.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. A couple of weeks ago, can you hear me all right? A couple of weeks ago, Bonnie Brzezowski made me an offer I couldn't refuse. She said, would you be willing to introduce Tracy Daugherty at his random review of Percival Everett's novel, James? As some of you know, I'm married to Tracy, and after I got over my shock, it occurred to me that the benefit of accepting this assignment might be simply, could I be disciplined enough to keep it a secret for 2 whole weeks and enjoy the look on his face right now? Pure terror. It's no secret that Tracy has published over 24 superb books across a spectrum of literary forms. A short list: biography, the short story, the novella, the novel, the essay, and the harder to pigeonhole narrative that blends biography, history, and cultural criticism. There's always a deep root of personal obsession: art, architecture, astronomy, music, just to name a few. Whatever the subject, he always embraces the big cultural picture with all its complexities and contradictions. This is especially true of his 5 biographies of 20th century American authors, which, taken as a whole, form a cultural history of post-war America. It's also true of his stunning double portrait of Muhammad Ali and George Harrison, We Shook Up the World, which was published in 2024. Nobody seems to know about it, so I'm just saying, okay? From the early 1980s, when he studied with Donald Barthelme at the University of Houston, and throughout his 3 decades teaching creative writing and literature at OSU, and founding our Master of Fine Arts program, which was extremely hard to do, he has never stopped writing. Just as remarkable, that whole time he's been there for family, friends, students, and colleagues, generations deep. It's been an honor and very instructive to have a window into Tracy's writing process. Because while the results of that process are visible in the form of publications, awards, and honors that I am not going to list because it embarrasses my modest introvert here, what isn't visible is the heavy lifting that goes on behind the scenes. As he likes to say to his students and other writers' friends, who shall remain nameless right now, just kick out a draft. That is, put your head down and do the work. And I think I'll just add, stop whinging. As many of you are aware of the biographies, but if you aren't, they begin with Hiding Man in 2009, a biography of his mentor, Donald Barthelme, a project Tracy undertook without thinking about its chances for publication. He just wanted to bring Barthelme's work back into the light of day. That book, published by St. Martin's Press, was a New York Times notable book of the year, and was followed by biographies of Joseph Heller, Joan Didion, Billy Lee Brammer, and most recently, Larry McMurtry. And for that book, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. This coming October, his biography of Cormac McCarthy will be published, and he will be going into the witness protection plan. Reviewers often note that these biographies read like novels, even as they set their subjects in a complex social and political context. That novelistic quality surely comes from the fact that Tracy is, at heart, a deeply driven storyteller. In addition to several short story collections and novels, he has, over the past decade, been writing novellas, that weird animal between the story and the novel that the writer Michael Ondaatje once called the perfect literary form. These novellas sometimes imagine their way into the private lives of historical figures, Willa Cather and the Russian poet Anna Akhmatova, to name just two. Sometimes they take us to the desolate landscapes of West Texas, where Tracy was raised. It's a stark desert landscape, an old ocean floor, but the sky is huge there, and it's this combination, a tough realism on the ground and a love of the big sky and the far horizon, that gives Tracy's work its particular essence, spiritual without ever being abstract. There's one more element that has a huge impact on his work. He's been a drummer since he was 4 years old, and his mother donated a footstool and 2 wooden spoons to the cause. Whether he's accompanying fellow musicians or listening for the rhythm of emerging sentences, he's got an unerring sense of the way a story needs to breathe and drive. I'd like to end by quoting the best-selling novelist T.C. Boyle, who has provided an advanced blurb for the Cormac McCarthy biography. It comments on the particular mix of literary gifts that Tracy brings to all his work and will, I'm sure, bring to his talk today on James. Quote, "The enigma revealed. Tracy Daugherty's biography of one of our most mysterious and iconic novelists reads like a novel itself in all its darkness, adventure, loss, and redemption. One of the most thrilling biographies I've ever come across." Please welcome Tracy Daugherty. A very embarrassed man.
How should I do this? Here? Will that work? Okay. Okay. Don't know. Well, that was a surprise. I think we should all just go home now. Thank you, my dear. And thanks to the Random Review Committee and to Charles. I'm very glad to be here, and I appreciate you all coming out this afternoon. I have a few remarks to make about James, and I understand that some of you have read the novel and some of you probably have not, which is okay. We'll try not to expose any spoilers for those of you who have not yet gotten to the book. But I do hope that after my remarks, we can all have a discussion together. Even if you haven't read the book, maybe something I raise in the talk will have some provocation for you or raise some questions for you. And I very much do want to know what's on your minds. It's really a fascinating topic we have here today. It was in July of 1876 when Samuel Clemens, who wrote under the name Mark Twain, began composing a novel called The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It had been exactly 100 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, whose preamble insisted all men are created equal, a promise that America has yet to fulfill and probably never will. Samuel Clemens foresaw this broken promise already when he drafted what is perhaps the single most powerful scene in all of American fiction. Young Huck is wrestling with his conscience. America has taught him that it is wrong to help free a slave, and he believes his soul will be punished eternally if he does so. But he's experienced the friendship, the kindness, and the wisdom of a slave named Jim. He's witnessed Jim's humanity, and he struggles to reconcile what he has been taught with what he has seen. Finally, in agony, he accepts his confusion, rejects the pressures of convention, and decides to aid Jim at all costs. All right, then, I'll go to hell, Huck tells himself. And arguably in that moment, he becomes the iconic American character. Almost immediately on its publication, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was banned by numerous public libraries across the country. Now, we're all aware that in the present day, the book is still often banned because the N word appears in it over 200 times. Noting this, one public school official in Fairfax County, Virginia, declared Huck Finn the most grotesque example of racist trash ever written, despite its sympathetic portrait of a slave, which was rare in the 19th century. In 1885, when the novel was first pulled from the shelves, beginning with the Concord, Massachusetts Public Library, race and racial stereotyping were not factors in the decision. They weren't even mentioned. Instead, librarians and critics considered the novel the veriest trash because it satirized the weaknesses of humanity, most explicitly in the scene where Huck wrestles with his conscience. The book was not elevating. Most offensive of all, said the critics, the boy's language was coarse and inelegant. Huck failed to use proper grammar. He didn't speak the way characters in novels were supposed to speak, presumably like a member of the British upper class. Huck starts his story, "You don't know about me, but that ain't no matter." Horrors. He should have said, "It is of no consequence that you are unacquainted with my lineage." 50 years after The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was first tossed into the garbage, Ernest Hemingway wrote a book called The Green Hills of Africa. In it, he said, all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huck Finn. It's the best book we've had. All American writing comes from that. There was nothing before. There has been nothing as good since. Of course, Americans did write books before Twain wrote Huck Finn. When Hemingway says there was nothing before Twain's novel, he means that prior to Twain, American literature strained to be proper and respectable, agreeable to literary critics, many of whom were Europeans or European trained. That is, Americans had to write like the British upper class. Huck Finn said, "To hell with that, I'm an American." Hemingway greatly appreciated Twain's extraordinary ear for daily American speech. In Huck Finn, he channeled over half a dozen regional American dialects, including that of a specific African-American community living in a small corner of southern Missouri. By the mid-20th century, Hemingway wasn't alone in reassessing the merits of Twain's novel. The poet T.S. Eliot remarked that far from being a coarse and inelegant failure, Twain's use of natural speech was an innovation, a new discovery in the English language. It was artistry of the highest degree to create the illusion that these words on the page came straight from Huck. Perhaps no one argued Twain's case more forcefully than Ralph Ellison, author of Invisible Man, one of the most incisive novels ever written about African-American life. Ellison insisted that the American nature is, in a sense, the product of the American language, a colloquial speech that began emerging long before the British colonials and Africans were transformed into Americans. Ellison went on to explain, it's a language that evolved from the King's English, but based itself upon the realities of the American land and institutions. And it began quite early as a vernacular revolt against the mother country. It is a language that began by merging the sounds of many tongues brought together in the struggle of diverse regions. And whether we admit it or not, much of the sound of our language is derived from the timbre of the African voice and the listening habits of the African ear. That's beautiful. Ellison went on to say that Twain understood all of this when he was writing Huck Finn, and that without the presence of Blacks, the book could not have been written. No Huck and Jim, no American novel as we know it, Ellison said. For not only is the Black man a co-creator of the language that Mark Twain raised to the level of literary eloquence, but Jim's condition is America, and Huck's commitment to freedom is the moral center of the novel. Of course, it's not Twain's novel, but Percival Everett's meditation on it, his expansion of it, that's our focus today. But before we turn to James, I'd like to make one more point about American speech and American literary language. When Twain's critics pronounced him a failure for not using proper novelistic language, they were operating on certain strict assumptions about the nature and the purpose of literature, assumptions inherited from Europe. Not only European language, the King's English, but European social conventions as well. Slavery was a disastrously unfortunate import into America from Europe, and its acceptance in the colonies assured it an unquestioned place in early American novels, alongside the use of proper grammar. By the very nature of the institution of slavery, slaves were denied formal education, so they could not be schooled in the rules of acceptable speech. Their misuse of language, as their overseers saw it, was proof of their inferiority, an insidious example of circular reasoning. Deny them an education, then disparage them for their ignorance. In any case, literature, the container, the gilded jewelry box of proper elegant language, was forbidden people of African descent in this country. Twain's critics, condemning him for his coarse language, could not even have conceived of an African American writing a novel. And yet, early American literature does offer a handful of remarkable books written by former slaves, men and women who managed miraculously, almost always surreptitiously, to learn to read and write, as James does in Percival Everett's novel. Everett mentions one of these early Black authors, William Wells Brown. I don't know if you can see this from back there, but here's a portrait of William Wells Brown. Sorry, I don't have computer images and things like that. I'm very old-fashioned. but William Wells Brown, a very important figure in American literature. He, at the beginning of chapter 16 in Percival Everett's book, James, when James begins writing his life history with the pencil he's secretly secured, when he scrawls on the page, "My name is James. I was sold when I was born and then sold again. My mother's mother was from someplace on the continent of Africa." When James writes those words, he's echoing almost directly the opening sentences of a book called The Narrative of William Wells Brown, a Fugitive Slave, written by himself. Brown wrote his memoir in the 1840s and published it in England. In the 1860s, he would go on to become the first African American to publish a novel, Clotel, or The President's Daughter. It's the story of Thomas Jefferson's Black daughter and granddaughters. Here's the irony, and Percival Everett was well aware of it, and it's very rich. In order to be taken seriously as a novelist, as a maker of American literature, William Wells Brown had to ignore the natural speech patterns of everyday Americans, both Black and white, and capitulate to the critics' notions of literary language. Clotel begins with the growing population of slaves in the southern states of America. There is a fearful increase of half-whites, most of whose fathers are slave owners and their mothers slaves. Society does not frown upon the man who sits with his mulatto child upon his knee whilst its mother stands a slave behind the chair. Perfectly proper, both the language and the social conventions being described. William Wells Brown did not like America's rules, but he knew what they were, and he knew he had to follow them to earn any regard at all as a writer. It was 20 years after Clotel appeared when the adventures of Huckleberry Finn would free American language from the critics' shackles and celebrate the diversity of American speech. It took a white man with his privileged position to pull it off. But from then on, anyone who could grab hold of a pencil and had something important to say and who worked at it had a chance at making literature. Now, as we know, along with its checkered history of banishment, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has also, at least since Hemingway's time, often been cited as the great American novel, one of the essential books in our nation's story. It's been cherished by many generations and overall Twain's greatness as an author is now rarely questioned. The presence of the N-word in the book still causes trouble. Trouble that is usually described rather benignly as a controversy. The word controversy suggests there are two sides to the story and implies a sort of, come on, can't we all get along approach to the problem? Work with me, we can solve this thing. With Huck Finn, the controversy usually runs this way. The N-word was common in Twain's day. It didn't startle readers then. It is unutterably offensive in our day, so naturally it startles us. But we must read the novel in its historical context and understand that Twain was a man of his time, not ours. His use of the word does not make him racist. He was condemning racism, as the story of the novel's very existence, makes plain. Okay, yes, runs the counter-argument. But as a man of his time, Twain was, despite his best intentions, infected by the country's racism. This is clear in his stereotyped portrayal of Jim as an uneducated, superstitious, childlike man. So the controversy rages. People take one side or the other. The book gets banned in one community, named the everybody reads choice in another, and life goes on in America. With James, published in 2024, Percival Everett decided that the best response to a complex work of art is another work of art. He pushed far beyond the Huck Finn controversy to study the very bones of Twain's novel, and by extension, to question the nature and character of American language and American literature. Percival Everett, a little background, was born in Fort Gordon, Georgia in 1956. His father was an Army sergeant and later a dentist, and he moved the family to Columbia, South Carolina, when Everett was still a baby. From an early age, Everett was a precocious reader. He has said that for him, reading is a subversive act. It allows a person to take control when control did not exist before. Reading allows you to control the meaning. He felt the power of books as a child. And as an adult, he said, he learned that fascists always rush to ban books because they don't want people to have the power books give them. He earned a degree in philosophy from the University of Miami, and clearly his knowledge came in handy while he was writing James. In several scenes in the novel, James engages in imaginary conversations on the nature of freedom and equality with some of the Western world's great thinkers, Voltaire, Locke, and Rousseau. In 1982, Everett earned a master's degree in creative writing from Brown University, and to date he has published over 30 books, one of which, Erasure, was made into a hit movie called American Fiction in 2023, and James won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2024. He has said that The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn provided him with one of his most cherished reading memories as a youngster. I have a lot of respect for Twain and that novel, he says. So much so that he rejects some readers' characterizations of James as a satire of Huck Finn or as a corrective to Twain's novel. I like to see James as being in conversation with Twain, he says. Now, his respect for Huck Finn and his cherished memories of reading it does not mean that he was untroubled by the book. The great writer Toni Morrison, who gave Black girls and women such eloquent voices in her fiction, and who was the last American novelist to win the Nobel Prize in literature. There was Bob Dylan in there somewhere, but I don't think, well, he has written novels, hasn't he? A novel. Anyway, we'll leave it with Toni. Anyway, Toni said, "Fear and alarm are what I remember most about my first encounter with Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Palpable alarm." She's talking about the shock that most Black readers naturally feel in coming across the complicated, uncomfortable portrait of Jim the slave. But like Morrison, Percival Everett recognized that it was not the novel's racial politics that really caused him fear and alarm, but its honest exploration of adult consequences in what pretends to be a child's adventure story. There was no guarantee of a happy ending for either Huck or Jim. Although Huck complains bitterly of rules and regulations, I see him to be running not from control, but from chaos. Nothing in society makes sense. All is in peril, Morrison said, and Everett agreed with her. How can you make sense of a society that puts so much emphasis on race, but cannot decide how to define race? Everett once asked, and he keeps asking that question in all of his books. He cites a racist 19th century politician in South Carolina named Pitchfork Ben Tillman. According to Everett, Pitchfork argued with his fellow politicians over the one-drop rule. In the 1800s, this rule was widely adopted throughout the United States as a legal means of identifying who was Black. The rule stated that any person with even one drop of African ancestry was classified as Black. It was used to strictly enforce racial segregation and to ensure that even mixed-race children were legally considered slaves. Everett says that Pitchfork Ben Tillman perceived a problem with the one-drop rule. He was smart enough to recognize that almost everyone in the country came from some kind of mixed background. Gentlemen, let's be honest with ourselves, he said. If we adopt this rule in South Carolina, not one of us can legally own land. His troubled conscience forced him to admit that in the United States, race wasn't really a matter of ancestry or blood, but of superficial appearances mandated by society. South Carolina turned out to be the only state that did not adopt the one-drop rule. Percival Everett first became acquainted with the one-drop rule and other kinks in America's racial history by reading the adventures of Huckleberry Finn and becoming curious about his nation's past. That is the subversion and the power of reading. His reading prompted him to embark on a literary career that has relentlessly explored what it means to be American and what it means to be free. So, aside from its clear entertainment value and its obvious desire to be provocative, what is James really about? Just as the controversies surrounding the adventures of Huckleberry Finn center on Twain's use of language, Everett's reconsideration of Twain makes language its major focus. For Everett, the issue runs far deeper than whether or not Twain's vocabulary was coarse and inelegant or innovative. For Everett, the issue is this: where does true American speech really come from? Now, Twain always claimed that he based the character of Huckleberry Finn on a white boy he knew as a child, a fellow named Tom Blankenship. But in all of his memoirs, his reminiscences and his autobiographical writings, Twain said the most entertaining oral storytellers he listened to as a child were, without exception, Black people, slaves, and the children of slaves he was surrounded by as a boy in Hannibal, Missouri. He consistently praised the artless, that is, the easy and natural turns of phrase in the tales of Black storytellers. He recalled with great fondness the pleasures tucked into the easygoing speech patterns of the African-American families he knew. On Sundays, he'd hear the soaring sounds of spirituals spilling from the open doorways of Black churches as he passed in the street. Knowing all this, it's easy to argue, in fact, it's hard not to argue, that the basic rhythms of speech in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which Ernest Hemingway says gave birth to all of American literature, come from the folks on whose backs most of America, certainly its early economy, was built. And this is the central drama at the heart of Percival Everett's James, the drama of language, and what language reveals about being American. Crucially, James narrates his own story here, and he speaks to us not at all like Jim the slave, the character we remember and expect to hear from the pages of Huckleberry Finn. Instead, James announces himself proudly as the mature, educated, complex adult male Everett knew most slaves to have been. James begins, "Those little bastards were hiding out there in the tall grass. The moon was not quite full, but bright, and it was behind them, so I could see them plain as day, though it was deep night." Now that's James's version of the story Huck tells in the second chapter of Twain's novel. In Huck's account, he and his friend Tom Sawyer sneak up on Jim to scare him. Jim was sitting in the kitchen door. We could see him pretty clear because there was a light behind him, Huck says. Now hear how completely Everett has reversed everything. The name Jim, childlike, informal, becomes the more distinguished, respectable James. Instead of being related by a young white boy speaking colloquially, the incident is described for us by a well-spoken black man. The light illuminates Huck and Tom, so James can spot them, rather than exposing Jim to the boys. And finally, instead of being unaware and susceptible to Huck and Tom's pranks, James is fully alert and highly prepared for whatever foolishness the boys try to pull on him. Now, that opening scene sets the terms of Everett's entire novel. With a few exceptions, the plot of James follows the story of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, with the essential difference that we now hear it all from James's point of view. Right away, we learn that James has a prolific command of language, not only in the clarity of his storytelling, but in his ability to mask his eloquence and the level of his education when he needs to feign ignorance to protect himself. Whenever white people come around, he falls back into the expected shuck and jive. He's like a banned book. He performs ignorance. Alone again, he resumes his mastery of words. Everett veers from Twain's plot whenever Huck and James, floating down the Mississippi River on their raft, get separated. Everett reverses Twain and follows the slave instead of the boy. In doing so, Everett upends the entirety of American literary history, abandoning the nominal white hero to trace his shadow, the minor character who turns out to be major after all. I won't uncork any spoilers here for those of you who haven't read the book, but I will say that late in the novel, James makes a shocking announcement to Huck. And all I'll say about it is that in that moment, I see Everett making his strongest comment on American language. James is letting Huck know all of your words come from me. There's a beautiful and provocative book called Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, written by Toni Morrison. And here's what she says in this beautiful little book. The United States stands out as being the oldest democracy in the world in which a black population accompanied, if one can use that word, white settlers. So black presence is central to any understanding of our national literature. She says, young America understood itself to be pressing toward a future of freedom, a kind of human dignity believed unprecedented in the world, summed up in the phrase, the American dream. But Morrison, in this little book, is puzzled by our history. When she reads young America's literature, our country's earliest novels and poems, she sees in it a profound absence of hope and promise. Instead, she discovers scenes of dire trouble, a picture of a struggling infant nation frightened and haunted. Haunted by what? By what it brought with it to the new world, black bodies in chains. And so our literature is haunted by shadows, by black presence and what it says about the character of America. Morrison argues that the all-American virtues celebrated in our most famous novels, individualism, industriousness, ingenuity, manifest destiny, are white America's attempts to define itself in comparison to its dark counterpart, sometimes in contrast to the nation's black population, sometimes in concert with it. Our poetry, our fiction, our essays are America's continuing struggle made visible to fulfill the promise of equality in the preamble of our Declaration of Independence. This is the deepest, profoundest understanding of Hemingway's insight that American literature springs from Huckleberry Finn. the boldest, most disturbing, and therefore most often banned early example of our nation's literary imagination, now brilliantly reimagined and reexamined by Percival Everett. Now, I've marked several passages in the novel that I'm happy to go over with you if you like, but at this point, I would like to stop and hear from all of you questions or comments or arguments, your own favorite passages or passages that might have raised problems for you. And maybe I can begin the discussion part of this session by pointing us to the very opening pages of James. For those of you who have read the book, you'll remember, and again, I hope you can see this from up here, that the first thing the reader encounters is not the chapter 1 in a formal typed out text, but what looks to be handwriting. And it's titled The Notebook of Daniel Decatur Emmett. And then we have several pages of handwritten song lyrics. This is the first thing we see. And we don't know what it is or what it's doing there. So it's a very confusing way to start a novel. And those of you who have read it and remember that, anybody have a thought about why Percival Everett would want to begin the book that way? Yes.
Aren't the song lyrics kind of like Joel Chandler Harris, Brer Rabbit, so it's like a white musicologist taking folk music from the black tradition and writing it down. So it's like a different white guy and a different part of the folk tradition, but the same thing that you were just describing about.
Yeah. Yeah, I have trouble reading it because the handwriting is as bad as my own. But yeah, they are folk lyrics, as you say. I come to town the other night. I heard a noise. I saw the light. You know, so it's colloquial language, and it's folky, and it's all about the lives of black people, but not imagined from within the lives of black people, from without them. Daniel Decatur Emmett, this is said to be from the notebook of Daniel Decatur Emmett. He was an actual historical figure, credited with beginning the first white minstrel shows, or I guess black minstrel shows would be the actual way to say it, where white people put on blackface and performed as black people. And he's also credited with writing the song Dixie. And he becomes a character in James. Those of you who've read it will remember. James runs into this man and joins the minstrel show for a short time in the book, which is not from Huckleberry Finn. That's Everett's invention. But he brings this historical figure into it. It's still an odd choice to begin the book with that because we don't know what it is when we first come across it. But I would argue that one way to think about it is, as I've been saying, that this is a book about language. And so the first thing we encounter is what appears to be handwriting on a page. It's not formal typed the way we think of when we pick up a novel. So it immediately calls our attention to the fact that we are looking at words on a page. So our first impression, whether we're conscious of it or not, is, we're not immediately immersed in a world of fiction. We're not immediately immersed in a story. We're immersed in words, in language. So Everett is announcing his attention right from the beginning. This is a book about words, and we're going to put the words right up front. And they're going to be handwritten, so you really have to look close to read them. I'm really going to make you aware of words on a page. That's what his book is about. It's about another book. It's about the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It's words on a page about words on a page, with huge consequences for our thinking about American history.
I don't know why, but it makes me think of the when you open like a sci-fi novel or something, or a fantasy novel. First thing you see, you don't see chapter 1 either. You see a map.
Yeah.
It's almost like placing you. Seems like it's placing you in the context of.
Exactly. Yeah. Everybody hear that comment? It's like sometimes when you open up a sci-fi book or maybe historical fiction, sometimes the first thing you'll see is a map. The author will put a map. Or there are other books that sort of list the cast of characters. And anytime there is a book like that doesn't actually begin by immediately bathing you in the story of the fictional world, it's telling you this is artificial. You know, we all know that this is a made-up story, and it's calling your attention to something else besides just immediately creating the illusion of a story that you can lose yourself in. It's trying to make you conscious of something else. So, you know, in a way, Percival Everett is announcing, I have an agenda here. I want to entertain you. I want to tell you a story that I hope you'll like. But there's another intention going on here. And my intention is to call your attention to language, first and foremost. Yes, ma'am.
So you said you wanted to open up for discussion.
Yes.
I read the book, as did my husband. I enjoyed, if that's the right word, I mean, the book is painful in some ways. But I went along with the story. My husband's main complaint was, and he's not here, his main complaint was, I don't buy it. How in the world could a slave brought up at that time without any kind of schooling or education have the command of philosophers and speak that well just by sneaking into his master's library and reading those books?
Okay.
He couldn't speak that well. And I was like, that didn't bother me. That didn't occur to me. I don't care. But my husband's very
Okay,
liberal.
okay, yeah.
I'm just wondering your comments on that.
Again, her comment, her husband objected to the fact, the fiction in the novel is that James has been sneaking into his master's library over time and reading his master's books. And by doing so, he has taught himself to read and write. And that's what you are asked to accept for how James came to be so literate and eloquent. And your husband did not buy it.
Well, I like impressionistic painting
Yeah,
and art.
yeah.
He likes photographs.
Yeah.
So, we have a different approach.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, do you think that he could have reached that level of education and speaking that well just by doing
I have some thoughts about that, but before I say what I think, others who've read the book, did you have trouble buying that premise?
It was fiction.
Right. No, I don't care.
I know, but I mean, tell your husband.
My husband in the whole room said, honey, it's fiction.
You know, one thing that I think this discussion already is raising is kind of the challenge that Percival Everett had in writing this book. So on the one hand, he had the challenge of telling a story and making us accept the premises of the story he's telling. But on the other hand, because he is very intent on making a comment on Mark Twain's book and on American literature, he is sneaking in ideas from outside the story. So the way I see that is, I do think it's a bit of a stretch, if you're looking purely at the mechanics of the story, to think that this man, James, could have taught himself to read and be as eloquent as he is in the book, just from sneaking in from time to time. That's a bit of a hard stretch. I agree with your husband to that extent.
Well, and also,
But
James speaks very well.
Yeah.
And my husband's point was, but his masters sound like a bunch of idiots.
Yeah, right, yeah. So yeah, I agree, it's a stretch. But Percival Everett is also expecting people who are going to be interested in reading this book are going to have at least some interest in Mark Twain's book and in the history of that book. And in the history of American, he's asking you to bring some knowledge from outside the book, I think. Those of us who know about William Wells Brown, the man I was talking about, the first African-American novelist, who is mentioned in James, Everett cites his example. And I think he's counting on that to sort of convince us too, like William Wells Brown did it. There's an actual historical figure who was able to do it. So you shouldn't have any trouble buying the fact that my character's doing it. Now you have to bring that knowledge to it yourself. It's not, so this is, again, I think part of the challenge that he had writing the book. He's got to convince you based on the mechanics of the story, but he's also expecting readers, and he's expecting a lot, to bring this knowledge to it. And so I think he's trying to play a double game there. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the final explosive scenes.
Yeah.
And most of my friends who have read it said that they predicted this, they foresaw it. I didn't. So what did I miss?
How do we do this without giving spoilers away? The final explosive scenes. How can we say this? There is an explosion of violence at the end of the book. James commits some violence, I guess we can say that much. And it turns out to be a happy ending for James. I think we can say that. And maybe we can go so far as to say, you know, James, who has been a slave all his life, been forced to be passive all his life, finally takes agency at the end and you know, takes control of his life, and he does so in a very violent manner. So.
But in the book, are there clues?
Are there clues? Again, before I jump in, anybody else have a thought?
I have a thought. Is there anybody here who hasn't read the book? Oh,
A few, yeah, I don't.
okay, that was.
Okay, yes, sir, yes, sir.
I would say that I am among the people that I didn't see it coming. So for me at least, it was just kind of I would say it felt like a natural progression story without it being like super like, this is what they're gonna do sort of thing.
When you say you didn't see it coming, does that mean you didn't think Jim had that in his character? Jim, I'm calling him Jim, I could call him James.
I would say it wasn't so much that as much as it was just kind of the sequential events of the plot sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's more so, because you know, I think James is definitely he's very capable, he's very intelligent, you know, he's got these, I want to say like woodsman skills, but I don't.
Yeah. No, that's fair, yeah.
And so I think from that perspective, if you will, one way to kind of look at the end of the book might be that he was acting more in self-defense rather than like malicious intent.
Yeah. Well, and one thing, it's not giving anything away because this is also true of Huckleberry Finn, so we'll use that as our template. We know that Jim, in addition to looking for freedom, he's looking for his wife and his family. And that's his main driving goal, is to get back to his family. And he's going to do anything he has to do that. So the question of whether we think Jim is capable, Jim, I keep calling him Jim, James, sorry, James, whether he's capable of violence, again, I think that's a legitimate question, whether the book prepares us for that. But certainly the book is telling us all along that he's going to do whatever he has to do to get back to his family. So there's that. Yes, Pat?
You know, I have the same reaction to this question as I do to Michelle's question, because I thought in both cases, Everett is talking about the potential of this person, this man.
Yeah.
In a way that, I mean, we know that some slaves learned to read. We know that, I felt like he was talking about what this man could have been, and that seems to me to relate to both.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing I wanted to say, and I think it's connected, what you've just described as you read your whole introduction to the book and the emphasis on language, having just finished reading Erasure, he wrote a long time before this, his interest in code switching and how language is used and what people expect of other people seems like such a perfect preamble
Right.
to this story, which I had not recognized until.
Right. And we can perhaps look at some specific ones if we want to, but there are so many scenes in this novel where there is, as you say, that code switching and the masking and the unmasking. There's a scene where Huck dresses up as a girl to go back into society. So Huck puts on a mask, and at that very same instant, the very following page, I think, we see James is writing for the first time. So James becomes unmasked as, a master of language. Huck becomes masked. Some of the other slaves that James encounters along the way, one's gender is very hard to determine. So we don't have gender identity very clear. Some of the slaves pass as white folks because their skin is lighter. So Everett is very clearly interested in talking about the superficiality of all these identifying markers. Yes, Mr. Ma'am. Oh, okay, sorry, over here, yes. Who wants to go first?
I didn't necessarily predict the ending, but like I could see it happening just because I really related with James with like this frustration towards this dominating group of like how, you know, I could really relate of how like his entire life, his entire lineage has been dictated by the actions of white people. And I think Everett really depends on the reader to come with knowledge of slavery in America. I don't really think you can get this piece if you don't have like a pretty thorough knowledge of slavery in America, because I feel like Everett is, you know, really linking back into slavery revolts and like how enslaved people did rebel and did violence against white people. And like, when I learned about that in my school, it always had like a kind of tone of like they didn't stand a chance, and like, oh, it was so silly of them to do it. And then I think one of the things that I liked about James is they really, like Everett really did, it wasn't necessarily like a useless cause. They were just so frustrated, so angry that it came out. Kind of like if you back a feral dog into a corner, you can only push so far.
Right. No, I think that's an excellent point. And in the same way that we are asked to have some historical knowledge in order to accept that James is able to learn to read and write, we are asked to have some historical knowledge, I think, to believe he does what he does at the end of the book, because as you say, it does kind of echo some actual historical slave revolts, things that did happen in American history that we should be able to bring our knowledge to the story and just have that be naturally accepted. Yes, ma'am.
I have a couple of comments. In your introduction, you were talking about Hemingway, and I can't remember which book it was, but Hemingway was denied the Pulitzer Prize because, in one instance, because of his language. They said it was crude, it was this, and so I find it interesting.
Yeah.
About that, because he has suffered the same problem.
Yeah.
That was one thing. And the second was, I started reading the book, and then I had to go on a road trip, so I listened to it. Oh my gosh, what a huge difference
Really?
it was to hear, because you would hear this language shift from his slave language.
Did Percival Everett read it himself?
No.
No, I didn't. I haven't heard the audio.
It was a black person. I don't know who it was. I can't remember. But it was so great because you would hear him being so slave-like, and then suddenly he's this intellectual guy, and it really sinks in for you. And I just thought, wow, everybody should listen to this on tape because it made such an impression on me.
Yeah.
And that language issue came out much stronger.
Well,
Heard it all the time.
I'll refer back to my wife's introduction, her mention of the word rhythm. You know, language is music, and the difference between the formal language that James uses when he's on his own and the shuck and jive mask he puts on in front of white people, the most stark difference you notice immediately is the rhythm changes.
Oh, yeah.
Not only the vocabulary, but the rhythm. Yeah, yeah. And I will say, just as a personal note, we've been talking about, do you buy the ending of the book? I will say that I don't have trouble accepting what's in James's character. But the book changes rhythm for me, and I do have a problem with that. I think the ending feels rushed. It's rhythmically wrong. My one criticism of Percival Everett, but that's a footnote.
The final thing is, I read a book, and I can't remember exactly the title, but it was something like the first people's history of the United States, something like that. I can't remember exactly.
Howard Zinn.
Pardon me?
A People's History of the United States,
Yeah.
Howard Zinn.
Something like that, but written from the American Indian perspective. And it's the same kind of thing. You hear different things. You learn about George Washington and his manifest destiny kind of idea. And so you have that same issue.
Yes.
And it was That was also very.
Yeah, yes, thank you. We have just a few minutes left. Yes, ma'am.
How do we learn language? We learn it by hearing. As little children, we mimic what we hear around us. If a slave is living with white people who communicate with each other, they hear them speaking in a certain way. If they hear them, they know how they speak. But it's dangerous for them to speak like that.
Yes.
Because that puts them on the same level. And, they could be hanging.
Right.
So I had no trouble accepting that James would, or any Black person, would be able to pick up the way to speak, because that's what they would hear.
Yes.
They were with.
Right, and another good point that you have there, language is power. That's what Everett says all along. It is a form of power. Who gets to use it and how they get to use it, absolutely. And again, that reversed argument that Twain grew up hearing the talk of slaves and of African Americans. So his language was, inextricably linked with all of that. Yeah. Any other final questions or thoughts that we haven't raised here that somebody wants to get to very quickly in the last few minutes? Yes.
I feel like bringing back the beginning of the book where we see this handwriting, I feel like it's Everett introducing the idea that white people have stolen language from Black people.
Yes.
This is going into like modern pop references. A lot of Gen Z slang actually comes from Black people. And we've, white Gen Zers have kind of stolen it and have made it super viral. And this has been a trend throughout history of where, like, even in the 90s and 80s, think about jazz music and blues, Black people.
Yeah.
Stole it, popularized it, and gave absolutely no credit. I feel like James is hinting.
Yes. So in learning how to read and write, yes. I'll try to summarize it. She's making the point that the beginning of the book, the handwritten song lyrics, are an example of white people stealing Black language, which has been constant throughout American history, still happening now. White performers stealing hip-hop rhythms and language and so on. It's been going on forever. And that's a terrific point because it is true. That's it's Black dialect handwritten by this man, Emmett, who had people put on blackface and appropriate Black identities, Black language, Black music. And the wonderful scene in the novel where James actually joins the minstrel review. He's a Black man, but he puts on blackface so that Emmett wants to smuggle him in there so the white audiences won't know he's Black. So he's a Black man pretending to be a Black man, pretending to be a white man, pretending to be a Black man. It's a brilliant scene. And it goes right to what you're talking about, the craziness of American history and the idea of cultural appropriation and all the consequences. Yes, ma'am, we'll do one more here.
Great, Tracy, thank you.
Okay, great, thank you.